Hey guys, today we're going to discuss about terrestrial orchids with pretty leaves. And while I think the most popular orchids that have beautiful foliage on the terrestrial side are the Paphiopedilums or slipper orchids in general, we're not going to talk about them. We made a lot of videos about them. I'm going to talk about my recent acquisition, the Icioclades, and also the Ludisia discolor, which you might remember I purchased around the beginning of the year and I didn't know if I would like it, but it turns out I do. I just need to perform a little maintenance on it, so I'll take you along and we'll discuss more about these orchids. So with that said, let's start the video. Now, in case you missed my birthday haul video, the part 1, I purchased myself a terrestrial orchid with absolutely fantastic leaves. And this is the Icioclades spatulifera. Now, regarding the name, I personally don't care all that much how people pronounce names. Everybody around the world will pronounce names differently, but I know there are a few of you guys who are really keen on names. To my Latin ears, Icioclades is what sounds more true to a Latin name. I also did find on the internet this pronunciation as being correct as well, not from the iOS though. I heard people saying Icioclades, pretty much like Aeretus, since we have pretty much the same grammar or pronunciation rules. I personally choose to call it Icioclades until further notice. You can call it whatever it is that you like. So this little beauty is a terrestrial orchid, which makes it very different from the Phalaenopsis, Cattleyas, Dendrobiums, the vast majority of orchids we can grow. It does not grow on trees. And with terrestrial orchids, generally you will not see roots just shooting out of the pot, going everywhere, like you would see with Cattleyas, Phalaenopsis, and other epiphytic orchids. And as we discussed in the Paphiopedilum video, these orchids need to be a little buried, not a lot. Their roots, being that they don't grow in the air, they need to be in close vicinity to the medium, if not inside the medium. And I've already repotted this one in the day that I purchased it because I just had some free time. I used the slipper orchid medium from Repot Me. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you don't know the product, check the link down below. I'm kind of out of those media, so I'm not going to be using those today with my other terrestrial orchid. But for terrestrials, generally, you would need something more water retentive, more fine, or actually finer, than the typical chunky bark or even LECA in particular environments. This one I potted in fine bark, which has some other elements in it. You'll read more about it in the presentation video, but as you can see, it is quite a finer medium in comparison to what I usually use, and I do suspect this orchid will do pretty well in this medium. But that will have to be one of the major differences between terrestrials and epiphytic. With epiphytes, you can just throw in a bark medium and chances are everything will be okay. If you use a finer medium, depending on environment, it can be tricky with those orchids. With these ones, it's pretty much the other way around. And even though in most cases terrestrials do have pretty thick roots, and it's the case of the Icioclades as well, it doesn't mean they're epiphytic. It is yet another adaptation to their environment, but those roots really cannot survive in the air. This does not mean the medium should be super compacted, super suffocating. The fact that they're terrestrial does not mean they grow in heavy clay soils like other types of plants. They actually grow in pretty light and fluffy mediums such as leaf debris, branches, twigs, and all of those things that have fallen on the forest floor, which are still very airy, but they're not as airy as just growing on a tree. In cultivation, some of these terrestrial orchids have some of the most beautiful patterns, and the Icioclades is one of the best looking ones, really. That's why I purchased it, not for the flowers. If you look at the flowers, I don't think you will be super impressed if you think about Bellaras or stuff of the sorts, and I just said that because I have a Bellara in front of me, which is just opening. So if you consider something like this, the flowers of these terrestrial orchids are really not all that spectacular. And let's think about the flowers of the Ludisia for a second. Ludisias produce tall flower spikes, which I presume have to do with the location. They grow on the forest floor, so they need to stand out. They need to send out straight vertical flower spikes. Also, the flowers tend to be bright colors. Now, this is just for Ludisia. I'm not sure all of them produce bright colors, but in any case, there is a pattern with these terrestrial orchids. They produce produce straight vertical flower spikes that stand out because at the level where they grow, they can have grasses, leaves fallen on them. So if they produce flowers close to the foliage, like the Bellina, let's say, chances of getting spotted by pollinators decrease. So there is a trend with these bottom dwellers, if I can call them like that. They do produce quite tall flower spikes. While the flowers are not very flashy or fragrant, to my knowledge, they do apparently get the job done. Also, being that they are terrestrial and they cannot tolerate the same amount of air as an epiphytic, in cultivation we don't really let these orchids go bone dry. The rule of letting orchids dry out thoroughly in between waterings doesn't really apply to these. I personally don't ever follow it because I do believe air is more important than letting something dry out, and especially in hydroponics. Anyway, I digress. Bottom line is these orchids are not as tolerant to drought as an epiphytic. And yes, this one has pseudobulbs, which are actually very, very cute. It can store nutrients and water, and this particular one can tolerate the drought better than the Ludisia. Because of this, it's not actually advisable to go many days with these orchids completely bone dry. How I water this one and how I've researched the culture should be is don't keep it soggy necessarily. It's not necessary, but also don't let it go super bone dry for too many days. So I will see how this one does. It's a new orchid, and I know some of you wanted to see a close-up of the foliage. It is absolutely beautiful. So those were a few words about the Icioclades and some terrestrial orchids generally, how they differ from the typical epiphytic orchids. I did not talk about light and temperature because that will just have to be species specific. Some of these orchids require a little bit more light than others. Typically they don't require super blazing sun, again because they're bottom dwellers. But these things can vary, so it's better to check the species that you have and its requirements. Also, temperature depends. This particular one is a warmer grower. The Ludisia, I'm not entirely sure, she can be an intermediate. Depends on its location, geographical location that is, and also altitude, because these orchids can come from a hot country, let's say, but from a higher elevation, from the mountainside, which changes everything. And an orchid which you would expect to be hot growing is actually cold growing because of the elevation. So I will not go into those types of details because this is not a care tutorial necessarily. I do want to wrap up the Icioclades story with saying that some representatives of this genus are actually invasive. At least this is what I read on the internet, and I will also link you down below to a video from a YouTuber who made lovely videos a while back. She's not posting anymore, but anyway, the video deals with some Icioclades that are just growing in her garden. They're not this variety, and you will see the leaves are not as beautiful, at least to my eyes, but it's interesting to know about those as well, so I'll link you down below to her video. Now, a much more common orchid than the Icioclades is the Ludisia discolor. This one you can find in flower shops. Not sure if it's available all around the world, at least in Europe it is, in the USA as well. So it is pretty popular and pretty inexpensive. And it follows the same patterns. It has beautiful foliage and not such a spectacular flower. We usually grow these orchids for their foliage, and personally I was never super attracted to it because the idea of orchids for me is something a little bit more wild. Epiphytes look very wild to me, but this orchid is starting to grow on me really. And ever since I purchased it, which you'll have the link down below to that video, I didn't really do anything to it except watering it, and in the middle of the summer I did have quite a few issues maintaining it hydrated. This one does not tolerate drought, I believe, as good as the other one, and the moment it went a little bit too dry, everything started to become even droopier. This orchid has a tendency to become pendant, as you can see. It actually looks prettier now, to my eyes, than it looked. But as you can see, we do have some maintenance related things that we can perform, and we should. I'm also going to repot it. I'll show you the setup I chose for it. But before that, I hope you can see there are no aerial roots. And if you look at this plant, you wouldn't say it's an orchid. It's a beautiful plant. It looks like a house plant, right? But it is an orchid. Today, I want to repot it. I want to give it a setup that will actually emphasize this droopy nature that it has. This made me love it even more. I like pendant displays. I have a thing. So for this orchid, I will actually go for a Lechuza pot. I think the bigger one, the taller ones, and a little side note spoiler here, I absolutely dislike the pond medium. I managed to kill my cymbidium that I potted in that Lechuza pot and medium. So I personally, due to my experience, cannot ever recommend the pond medium with any orchid. Just beware, because we're talking about the Lechuza pot. I will be using the pot. The pot looks great, it's fantastic, has a gauge, but I shall not be using the pond ever again with any orchid. Okay, so first off, I'm going to get rid of all of these leaves that were spent and dried. As far as I understand, this is pretty normal for Ludisia orchids. In the end, you will remain with a sort of bare stem, which can be a little unsightly, but you can actually prune this orchid. I don't think we're there yet, but when the time comes, we'll do so. This is where the flower spike was. Do you see this? And the stem itself is dead, and this is an offshoot. So let's try not to break anything. I need to cut that with scissors. And this already looks a lot better. Let us unpot the orchid. I have never seen the roots of this orchid because they're not aerial. So let's squeeze on the pot. Oh, look at that. Is this a little plantlet? So this medium appears to be a mixture of bark, which is slightly decomposed. I'm gonna go over the trash can to do this because it gets very messy, and I'll come back when I'm done. Okay, so this is quite interesting and slightly bizarre for somebody who's never worked with Odyssia Roots. So inside the medium we have an entire system of rhizomes and also roots, which appear to be fuzzy and quite similar to Paphiopedilum roots. So that's nice. However, because they're fuzzy and just so attached to this medium, I'm not going to remove everything. I'm just going to let it be because typically terrestrials are a lot more tolerant to decaying medium, let's put it like that, with very low pH. They're not okay with suffocation, obviously, no orchid is, but these guys can tolerate the medium going a little bit more acidic than an epiphytic orchid, which is logical. Epiphytes grow on trees, they don't actually experience dead decay matter excessively, they're not surrounded by it, while terrestrials are. So I think I shall let this be rather than stress the orchid even more. My medium of choice though will not be soil, it will be a mixture of bark chips and cocoa peat and also sphagnum moss. And the pot that I will go for is the Lechuza one, the self-watering one with quite the big reservoir. In the winter time, I don't need the reservoir to be full, but in the summertime, I think this will be great. This orchid appears to be rather thirsty, or at least it was for me in my very hot climate. So I think this will do okay, and it is a tall pot, as you can see. It promotes a nice display, in my opinion, for a pendant orchid such as the Ludisia. So let's get the medium ready. When it comes to terrestrial orchids, if you don't want to use soils, sphagnum moss is actually your best bet. There are a lot of terrestrial orchids which are grown in full moss. I had my Habanerian moss. It's okay. Moss is a very versatile medium. It just degrades faster. This particular moss, though, is a really good quality. We'll talk about it in a different video. And I want to make it a little bit more airy though, so that's why I'm using that mix as well. That's not the compo mix, it's a different one. It's the more expensive one that I have, which is not as bad. It's pretty decent, but the chunks are pretty large, and for the tiny Paphiopedilums that I have, it's not suited. But for this girl, it will be just fine because I'm just going to use it for drainage. And mostly I will be working with moss. I love moss. So I'm going to be making the mixture as I go, actually. And there you have it. Looks quite good. Let us check the level, and looks okay. Now I need to put medium around the orchid, which will not be super easy, but not impossible either. And here we have them, two very different terrestrial orchids. One has pseudobulbs, the other one looks more like a jungle, but they are really pretty, and if you like the foliage, I would definitely go for it. Don't expect much from the flowers, I would say. Now there is another terrestrial orchid which looks a little bit similar to the Ludisia. It is called a Macodes. I'm not entirely sure if I've ever seen it in flower shops, and I didn't know it was an orchid. Anyway, that looks really interesting as well. I will keep my eyes out for it, but there you have it. Another one for your wish list if you're interested in foliage orchids. I think it's safe to say these orchids are mainly kept for their foliage and even display. Why not? I believe something like this is really attractive. And mind you, I just potted this one, and part of it should have been a little deeper, but the shape of the pot really didn't permit it. So it's not the most beautiful display because it's new, but the orchid will grow in it very well and will take to its shape. I do believe it's absolutely fantastic as a display as well. So there we have it. You have the names of all of these orchids in the description, along with some links, some of them to my videos, some of them to the orchid species website or the AOS, just so you learn more about these orchids. So alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and you know the drill. Like or dislike this video below. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other orchid related subjects. And if you like YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a new video, just turn on notifications for my channel. Oh, I'm running out of breath. If you're interested in my other setup with my other orchids, just check the description once again. I have everything listed there, music is there, everything is in the description. So that's it. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.